Hey folks, whether you're a fan of Soulslikes or Metroidvanias, you're gonna be eating good today, since the folks at Game Critics shot me a review copy of new core games The Devil Within Satgat, a challenging title some of you may recognize from my time with their demo. Here's the thing though, as much as I have a weakness for the genre, did I need to give this devil my due, or was I all too eager to hang my hat and move on? I'm your host Arlian, let's find out together. Starting with the story. Once, the small country of Joseon was peaceful, its prosperity literally fueled by a substance known as the pure white oil. Unfortunately, that tranquility was delicate, as the source of the oil, the Radiant Spire, transformed into a foreboding ebon structure and served as a focal point for a brutal invasion by demonic entities and an insidious infection that possessed both living and dead bodies. A disastrous calamity that forced Joseon to rally its military might in a desperate raid meant to shatter the Spire's heart, and which ended in failure due to an unforeseen betrayal. And this is where Satgat truly begins, with Kim Rip, a survivor of that ill-fated expedition who was not only left amnesiac, but also changed, as he now serves as a vessel for a demonic entity, whose supposedly benign nature is likely tied to the infernal energy that's warped his arm. And that's the least of his concerns, given the conspiracies which lay poised to ruin the country, and the grudges Kim Rip needs to navigate. All given, it's a fine enough premise, and Satgat does a decent job of splitting it up between small cutscenes during the stage, optional dialogues that occur at campfires, and which can be replayed in case you skipped it, as well as bits of lore that you can collect scattered about the stages. That said, I'd be lying if I didn't have a few quibbles with the way it's executed on a narrative front. Mostly because half of the game is spent dealing with a nigh literal conga line of assassins who have an axe to grind over a supposed betrayal, one which they really aren't all that keen to elaborate on, other than it had something to do with the failed Ebony Spire operation. You know, the one that we saw in the opening segment and which ended in us being betrayed? And sure, I'd normally say it's possible that the events we saw had some creative liberties taken with them, a little wishful thinking to make unpalatable actions less so. Except Kim Rip goes on the record to say he doesn't remember how things went down, so that bit of backstory exists only for the player, a detail which adds a considerable degree of dark comedy to those boss fights, as they basically boil down to someone going, "Traitor!" and then Kim Rip going, "Well, I can't remember enough to say otherwise," and then they fight to the death. Still, as bewildering as that may be, I did start to warm up to the story once I hit the second act, since by that point, the plot stops being poor communication kills and focuses more on the country itself, as well as how it got the way it is and why. It's at this point that all the smaller scenes, collectible lore, and dialogue all together to paint a neat little picture and bring things together for a fairly satisfying culmination. And then the third act kicks in, and well, it exists, as does its villain, the guy who twirled his mustache evilly once and then got lost by the plot. Seriously, I couldn't give a singular about this guy, since I knew so little about them, save that their motivation could be summed up as wanting to have the biggest, best mustache to twirl. And it's not like he works all that hard to achieve his goals either. He's legitimately the least memorable aspect of his own act, and it was only during the tail end that I found myself pleasantly surprised. And that was largely by dint of a fairly solid conclusion. So yeah, there's that. Otherwise, the only story bits I haven't addressed are the little mechanical odds and ends I haven't gone over yet, like how the lore collectibles provide tasty bits of experience to incentivize chasing them down, and the bestiary ones require you to hunt down the associated creatures to properly unlock their entries for more experience. Like, that was neat. It was fun to get lore that way and a little bit of that sweet, precious loot. But what can I say about the experience at large? Well, genre-wise, Satgat is a Souls-flavored Metroidvania that leans more towards combat than its exploration elements. Like, don't get me wrong, it definitely has the basics for what you'd expect from a Metroidvania down. That said, the exploration elements are a bit more controlled than what I was initially expecting, since out of the 4 major regions you're given to explore, The first one plays out in a largely linear fashion, at least in your first visit, albeit with a bit of leeway to wander off into nooks to find a chest or fiddle with a light puzzle. In fact, of the regions, it's the second and fourth that offer the most leeway for what a player can do at a given time, given that the third act also has a rather distinct direction it guides players along for the bulk of it. Still, I did have a fair bit of fun with it. The areas themselves are fairly vast, and they're constructed in such a way that you can occasionally sequence break your way to a treasure chest earlier than was intended with some clever shenanigans, especially once you start to earn more of the movement-related upgrades from progressing forward. By the tail end of the experience, moving about the map feels fairly fluid, especially once you factor in the sheer amount of shortcuts that can be unlocked, which helps to make backtracking a lot less painful even without factoring in the fast travel that's available. Which is probably why the purgatory zones and the final areas stick out so much. They're, without a doubt, the most painful bit of platforming in the entire game. Even now, a week and change after I had cleared it, I was at a loss for why, just the why of it, since each one is a semi-lengthy obstacle course with a dash of light puzzle solving and an infinitely spawning army of Medusa head adjacent enemies who instantly punch you to the start of the zone whenever they tag you. And they can come out of the walls, the floors at silly angles, and you can't see them till they've emerged. Like, sure, you can create safe zones, but they're very temporary. The command has a small cooldown, and it does nothing for when you need to let those safe zones diminish so you can advance. It's a legitimately galling experience, and without a doubt, the worst bit of platforming in the game. And no, before you try and get clever, while empowered defensive actions normally provide iframes and a time slow effect that would be useful in a situation like this, in practice it's a struggle to get it to work right because you'll actually outpace the screen and wind up getting hit when the time runs out. It's just... Which reminds me, while I've talked a fair bit about the exploration in Satgat, the real meat of the experience is a bit more visceral in nature, since the game has a fairly involved combat system to toy around with. One which should feel familiar enough to most Souls-like veterans, but leans more towards the forgiving side of things. Well, sort of. Enemies will still obliterate you soundly if you get sloppy, thus obliging the same old song and dance of respawning at a bonfire and retrieving your hard-earned experience. And yes, you'll still be navigating limited healing resources, but Satgat's stamina system is a bit different than the average Souls player will be used to, since only defensive actions and heavier special attacks drain it, which let me spam light slashes at will, more often than not smearing basic enemies. Just don't try pulling that on bosses or elite enemies, because Satgat's combat veers a bit closer towards the Sekiro side of things. Which is to say, enemies have posture meters, and it will absolutely behoove you to whittle it down for harder enemies. And that was where the real fun for me started, because Satgat's stamina system is a bit more precise, taking the form of a limited number of pips which regenerate at a steady enough pace, but still slowly enough that mindlessly spamming attacks will rapidly deplete it. And once it's gone, things will get dire quick, because not only does it limit your offensive options to strictly light attacks, it also disables your defensive options until you've fully recovered from exhaustion. And in all honesty, while you're certainly capable of doing a sizable amount of damage from your normal attack rotations, it's your 3 defensive options that put in the most work towards shattering an enemy's guard. It's a niche system that definitely lends itself towards a careful back and forth dance and punishes recklessness, but it's made especially interesting because of how your defensive tools work, since they all fulfill different roles. For instance, your block is simple enough, reducing damage considerably as long as it's held down at the cost of stamina points per hit soaked. Unless you perfectly parry, since you then get some generous iframes and a nifty counterattack. That said, the quirk that I found really unexpected was how different the backstep and forward dash turned out to be. At a glance, I expected it to just be different in which direction I was going to go while getting iframes, but in practice, the difference becomes a lot more meaningful once you factor in concentration, a gauge system that builds up as you attack and perfectly defend. Once you earn enough concentration, you get the option to release an empowered form of your defensive abilities when perfectly triggered. Specifically, each type of defensive action gets 3 different variants, which not only look cool, but also provide a surprising degree of tactical flexibility, since the range, damage, and positioning they afford you is starkly different, and yes, that includes the backdash and forward dash. Like, once I got the hang of it, I had so much fun with the boss fight, since I frequently found myself hugging the line between decisive victories and being outright obliterated. And there was always something satisfying about seeing a boss get staggered and then using a finisher, since not only do they do silly amounts of damage, they also recover sizable amounts of health, which help to keep me in the fray. Simply put, it's just good. Really, my only regret on the combat side of things is that while the game does introduce a gunplay element fairly early on, they're more of a standalone part of your arsenal, as you're not able to fluidly pull one out in the middle of a combo, since their opening frames and recoil animations are comparatively lengthy, and you don't really have much in the way of cancel options, leaving them as more of a tool meant to plink at an enemy when they play keep away, or a quick burst of damage when you stagger an enemy before using a finisher, or just absolutely obliterating trash mobs. That said, I really do have to give the game credit, because regardless of the enemy, I always found myself with a point during the fight where I could make use of the tools I had. Sure, there'd be times where I'd be dealing with an enemy relentlessly trying to cancel my life subscription, but if they broke away from me and I recognized the start of an attack that might take them into the air or an evasive maneuver, I could pull back and pop out chip damage, which honestly felt necessary at times because the bosses are involved. All of them are multi-stage endeavors with complex enough attack patterns that it took me some time to adjust to the ways that they could be mixed up, and which required a bit of relearning on my part when I started engaging with the optional boss rematch challenges, because not only did they have me fighting amped up boss variants for bonus rewards like hidden accessories and the keys to rare chests, the latter phases also required me to crank the game to hard mode, and hard really doesn't around, because the boost in lethality isn't the damage dealt in this case. Like, it sure as hell doesn't help, but the real problem was the way in which the bosses gained new moves or variants to their existing ones and executed them faster. It is brutal, and the bosses were hardly the only challenge either. While I could by and large trample the normal enemies I encountered, the elite enemies were deceptively dangerous as well, since I initially mistook them for just bigger versions of normal enemies, only to get sucker punched by attacks the normal variants didn't have. I wanted the silver keys they dropped though, since they grant access to the rare chests scattered about each region, and thus better means of customizing my character. And when I say customize, I'm not kidding, because Satgat's character building is fairly involved, being divided between your weapon loadout, your accessories, and your skill tree. Really, your skill tree is probably the most complicated part because of how weird leveling is. See, whenever you level up at a bonfire, you're given essence to spend on your skills, which allows you to unlock nodes in your skill tree. Only the essence you gain is split between several different types, and you only gain a certain amount, and it's hardly predictable which you'll get at a given point. It's a design choice that adds a lot of weight to which direction you want to go with your skills, even with how cheap it is to respec. And I was far from having everything maxed, even at the tail end of a playthrough where I'd taken my time to grind. I was more than happy where I'd stuffed my points though. It really worked for the combat style I had. Comparatively, the accessories are a bit easier, as you're mostly slotting in things like having a bit more damage, crit, or attack speed. Or my personal favorite, the accessory that increases how effective blocking is. An absolute lifesaver while you're learning block patterns or until you get the skill that ups the perfect parry timing. Admittedly, what accessories I chose were largely informed by my weapons. Less so the guns, since that mostly boils down to what kind of ranged death you want to deal, and more so the swords, because while they all share movesets, the stats on them are significantly different, ranging from crit-focused weapons to the basic sword, which is a very solid all-rounder when maxed, to weapons which focus on generating concentration, staggering enemies, or even block. Surprisingly, these statistical differences did make for some fairly marked changes in my playstyle, with things like attack speed allowing me to be a lot more aggressive and have openings that aren't normally there, or stagger allowing for more recovery-oriented opportunities during a boss fight. It just works, surprisingly enough. Really, my only regret is that it took a substantial bit of grinding to level up the various weapons to see how marked the differences get, and the fact that the ultimate upgrade materials are limited to 2 for guns and 2 for the swords. And no, there's no New Game Plus, so I didn't have the option of looping to explore for science. But that's largely the gameplay. Really, the only thing I didn't mention was the Haite, which are discoverable doggos scattered through each area. Using one grants a scale, uses a special shop, and reveals a chunk of the map. But well, the latter element is... You know what, let's just get into the visuals, and specifically the map, and it's a little bit weird on the details. For instance, while it shows bonfires, where you can have a rematch with the main region boss and teleport around, and silver and gold chests, it doesn't show any smaller chests you've passed by, and it doesn't let you put down any markers. It's also a bit persnickety when you're trying to fast travel, since the cursor will just drift over to chests and adjacent things, making it annoying to use at times. It's weird. Thankfully, that's the extent of my grievances on the visual front, since I'm otherwise quite fond of Satgat. Environment-wise, each new area provided plenty of details to soak in, and as for the combat, there's a decent amount of variety for enemy designs and some really impressive looking bosses. Basically, if you want a game where the combat looks and feels good, Satgat definitely does a good job on this front, and I generally found that the animation windups did a good job of cueing to the player when they should dodge or block, which made things feel like my fault when I botched my defense or misread an opening. And I'll admit that it was a nice detail that the swords do look different when you swap them around, though if you're poking at the costumes hoping for a markedly different Kim, they are palette swaps plain and simple. That said, if I had to provide a solid grievance about Satgat on a visual level, it'd be the fact that there's a little nook in the 4th area, a small puzzle platforming gauntlet that takes place over a bottomless pit. While it's not actually that hard to navigate once you get all the abilities, I actually got to the other side early on before this due to some clever movement shenanigans, and then stumbled into the void, at which point the screen went black. It's not that the game froze, the screen was just black until I died enough times to send myself back to a bonfire, which was super annoying once I realized I had to flawlessly travel back to where I died and not flub the jump to get my experience back. I'm sure you can guess how this comedy of errors went and why it stuck with me. Beyond that, Satgat's OST is a solid accompaniment to the journey, and I actually found myself surprised at how good a few of the ambient tracks were for setting the mood. That said, my biggest surprise was the voice acting. While I've already gone on record to say I wasn't exactly wowed by the story, the voice actors really went for it here, and I found myself listening to the story segments just to see how they were going to read their lines.
What the hell are you talking about? Aren't you the Kim Rip that I know? No. No! It can't be! Don't try to make a fool of me, Kim Rip! Damn it!
So, kudos on that. All in all, for just the conclusion, I came away from Satgat feeling satisfied. While it did take a little bit for the game to really pick up steam, once it did, I was hooked. There was just something engaging about the combat, how many options I was provided through the various customization features, at the enemies and boss encounters the game had lined up, as well as the sheer lethality of them. I loved the sense of mastery that came with conquering fights that could end as quickly as they started. I guess there's easy difficulty if that sounds too harrowing, but I knew what I was here for.
Just to suffer.
That's not to say I didn't enjoy the other aspects of Satgat. Again, it's fun to explore once the game opens up a bit more, and I did have fun tinkering with the minor bits of puzzle solving or secret hunting. And the story really does get better once you get rid of the let's jump to conclusions gang, to the point that as a whole, I can safely say that Satgat Devil Within is a very solid hit. That said, if you're a combat junkie looking for a solid challenge, then I cannot recommend this game strongly enough because it certainly provides. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you have something to say, leave a comment, and if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews and interviews, hit subscribe and the bell. For a link to my Discord, the Crit Hit Cauldron, check the description, and check out my Patreon to see reviews early and support the channel, like Andy noted. Also, I have a merch house with neat swag like Crit Hit coffee mugs and shirts. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks. And also, feel free to make a recommendation for a game for me to check out in the comments. Bye!